What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today my guest is Stephen Morgan. Stephen is a psychiatric survivor, and he is a trainer for intentional peer support and has worked in peer support settings for more than 2 decades. Stephen was also the project developer for Soteria House in Vermont. So welcome to Madness Radio, Stephen Morgan.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, I want to remind people that I interviewed you a while back on Madness Radio, and that interview gets more into maybe some of your personal story as a psychiatric survivor and the system. And since then, we've had a lot of really interesting conversations. And so people can check that out on the Madness Radio archives. And since then, you and I have had a lot of very interesting conversations about what is reality, what is psychosis, what is the nature of mind, how psychedelics maybe play a role in understanding that. I noticed that you're calling in from your caravan because you're out in the wilderness, traveling and living very, very close to nature, which you've been doing for many years. I love seeing your hand-built trailer there, and you're in a really beautiful setting. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and what has drawn you to live so close to nature.
Yes, well, I've currently got a little 65 square foot camper, and I've been on the road in some form or fashion for about 10 years. I've had a couple of periods where I've jumped off for various reasons, but it's mostly been consistent. And I've been living west of the Rocky Mountains. That's sort of been the only thing for me that's been really important, is I don't want to go back east, which is where I'm from.
How come?
Well, I love the Southeast. There was a lot of reasons why I tried to make this kind of lifestyle work. Part of what was really, really active for me back then was I have extreme sensitivities to machine noise and sound. And it didn't matter how far I traveled into the woods. You know, I lived in Vermont for 8 years. It just didn't matter. I'd always hear a lawnmower, an airplane, those kinds of things. Well, I tried everything, I tried meditating with them. I tried all this different stuff. And so I needed quiet. And I was actually looking at flight paths and trying to find where airplanes don't fly overhead. So the real propulsion for me actually finally making the leap was I got really sick with an autoimmune disease. And there's something about all of that, what else you have to lose kind of thing, take the risk. And that's how I kind of initially got started.
So the autoimmune disease is connected to the machine sensitivity, or is it also about pollution exposure and air quality?
Globally, autoimmune diseases are on the rise, and there's a lot that's tied into post-industrial life that I think is valid. The specific disease I have is called ankylosing spondylitis. It's a process where my bones fuse together. It's actually been observed in dinosaurs. It's in part bacterially caused, it's in part genetic. I mean, there's all that stuff, the physicalist explanation, but I think there's all kinds of other layers. But it's been around on the planet for a long time.
So the physical condition is like the bones start to fuse together, and they've actually observed this in fossils in dinosaurs?
Yes.
Whoa. That's like some serious ancestral healing going on there.
No. Well, bacteria have been around for so long, and they're forming communities, so they're also sort of fighting it out. They're doing all the same stuff we are. And this particular bacteria that's associated with my autoimmune disease, it's very, very, very old. The bacteria itself is not necessarily harmful for creatures, but if certain conditions are met, then your immune system may start attacking your body, trying to wipe out the bacteria, and it's confused. And so it attacks these cells that are in the collagen between your bones. And as it attacks the collagen, it wears that out, and your body's constantly trying to repair that by building new bone, which causes fusion. So it's a very painful disease. Usually if you break your leg, your body sends a bunch of inflammation, it starts healing it and things get better. But this is a process when it's really active. It's the equivalent of kind of breaking a bone every night. So you just start over and start over.
So you've been really compelled to make your way into the wilderness west of the Rockies. And how is it that being in nature helps your autoimmune condition? I mean, is it the calm and peacefulness? Is it the toxin exposure, or
I think there's just a whole lot of layers with that. I've been kind of compelled to just spend time in wilderness as much as possible since I was young, and that became very, very active in my 20s. That's when I was in hospitals and stuff like that. Yeah, I moved to Vermont. I got a job there, and I loved Vermont. It was quiet. I wanted to be in natural settings and a lot of community life there, a lot of wonderful things. But this little devil or angel in me kept pushing me that I needed more connection with wilderness than I could get there. And when the autoimmune disease started when I was 28, it wasn't terrible. It took about 4 years to start to get bad. So I'm in my early 30s. And then part of it was the psychological trauma of just not knowing if I'm going to be physically disabled. So when it got really active, about 31, 32, I was the director of a community center for psychiatric survivors called Another Way.
Which is a great program in Montpelier, Vermont. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been around for decades. Very interesting. It's gone through a lot of shifts. That was kind of where I cut my teeth on the sort of grassroots peer support, where when I came in, we had a little budget, but no one was really paying attention to what we were doing there, and we owned a house. I had also been concurrently for about 4 or 5 years working on getting the Soteria House funded. We got it funded from the legislature, and this was sort of my dream job. I'd been wanting to do this, and I came into that work. And then after a few months, I was at the end point of a year and a half of sickness, so where I just couldn't take it anymore. I was like, I have to uproot everything. I had a little bit of savings. I mean, peer support is kind of hard to save a lot of money. And I took my old car and I drove out west. And at that time, I spent 5 months on the road living in like a little coffin-sized tent that you would take on like the Appalachian Trail or something. And that was, yeah, I guess the healing, when you're asking about like, what is it about it? The quiet, the communion with other creatures, and honestly, just sunlight. Like, there's not a lot of sunlight up in Vermont.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That was huge. I've been fortunate that I've had periods in my life where I can just put down a calendar and I don't have to pay attention to clock time. All of that stuff I found incredibly healing as well. And I should also say, at base of all this, I've been doing like very radical dieting for 10 years. So that also has a huge part. And eventually, when I left Vermont and I headed out west, about a few months into it, I started going into remission,
Great.
which was amazing. It was kind of a miracle. And that lasted for 3 years, but then it came back with a vengeance. So,
Oh, uh-huh.
mhm.
So that's where you are now. You're out of remission and into the vengeance.
Well, I went through 4 years. My job, I was the operations manager and trainer for intentional peer support. So I was kind of flying all over the world, and I had to go to India, and I got some of the things that you get in your arm
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
before going to India. And a few weeks later, my autoimmune symptoms turned back on. This is 2016. And once they came back on, they came about 10 times worse, and I couldn't turn them off no matter what I did. I mean, and that lasted about 4 years, culminating in 2020 was just a hellscape of disability, couldn't walk for, hospitalized, all that kind of stuff. But anyways, the last 2 years I've been in a kind of remission for most of the time.
So what I'm hearing is that you were pushed by your physical illness, but you're also seeking something. You've been trying to find a way, and it's been healing
Hmm.
for you. But I also know that this has been part of your own spiritual and philosophical quest or journey or process to get closer to nature. And you said being closer
Hmm.
to the creatures. And I know you and I have talked quite a lot about what is this thing called psychosis. I'm really interested to hear what are some of the things that you're discovering 10 years on the road, 10 years living really close to nature, unplugged, disconnected, very, very much off the grid quite a lot, but then bouncing back in to do your trainings and doing traveling. And what are some of the things that you've been kind of exploring on a spiritual, psychological level?
The way I think about it, in my 20s, I had a very kind of vertical orientation. I was very interested in God, and then I left my Christian religion. I explored Taoism and Buddhism, the Bhagavad Gita, all of that for a while, very vertically oriented.
When you say vertically oriented, how do you mean? Like the metaphysical, looking beyond and
Yes. Yeah, the transcendent and questions of purpose that have to do with not utilitarian purpose, but about like why were we made?
ultimate meaning and
Yes.
the answers? What is life?
And then I stepped off that path, in part because, it's kind of deep into some of the Eastern practices and stuff. And I kind of came to realize that, well, one, I'm a Westerner. So that's my ancestral lineage. It's actually not the East. And I suppose if I was going to say one thing the West has done well, it's actually an allegiance to the passions. And I kind of realized that this sort of dispassionate way of being felt a little bit like it wasn't aligned with some sort of deep ancestral history in me. So, and I also would notice, with meditation and stuff, that allowed a certain kind of consciousness that was really beautiful because it allowed me to get a handle over my mind. But I often felt disconnected from people and I wanted more connection. And so I kind of abandoned ship entirely.
That's really interesting. So I think we tend to abstract religious traditions and religious practices from their cultural context. But it seems to me that
Hmm.
maybe Eastern philosophies are really super interested in detachment and stepping away from the world and the letting go of the web of relationships because people are so deeply, deeply embedded in that. So you have a mainstream culture in India or China that's very super family oriented and very super about connection and involvement and activity. And so the spirituality that emerges is about detachment. Whereas maybe in the West, we suffer from the opposite thing. We're really super individualistic. We're already kind of detached. Everything is moving so fast that like it comes and just let it go because your job is going to change, your community is going to change. And then you have a religious tradition that's more about relationship and more about connection and maybe more about passion. So it makes sense why there would be an attraction to the Eastern philosophies because, in a weird way, they kind of reinforce the non attachment and the letting go, and everything is changing. And let's just roll with the changes and it's a go with the flow sort of ephemerality.
Oh, that's really interesting.
So, what we really need is more connection. But instead, we go with what culturally fits, which is this import of Buddhism and import of Taoism, which is kind of more individualistic. So it sort of appeals to us like yoga. I'm thinking yoga practice has been so picked up because it fits with this Western Protestant self improvement thing, which maybe makes sense in India, where you're so embedded in traditions. But here we just have a marketplace of traditions. We just have this incredible individualism. So the individualism of the East, which would make sense in the East,
Right.
where it's conflicting with tradition or it's counterbalancing or compensating for tradition. Here, it sort of just goes along with the mainstream, and that's what so it fits in so well.
That's really interesting. It's interesting to think about it like that religious traditions have a countervailing influence. They're sort of speaking to what's not currently there.
What's missing? Yeah,
Yeah, and I just don't think religious traditions can be deracinated from the land out of which they emerged, and especially the cultural history. And I learned a lot from
mm-hmm.
studying Eastern traditions and got a lot out of it. For instance, mindfulness, to treat meditation as sort of an act of managing anxiety is ridiculous. Meditation arose in a culture where people are trying to understand the fundamentals of the universe. I mean, that's a really different modality.
You might increase your anxiety if you're encountering the nature of the universe. It might actually add to your distress, but people don't approach it now. They approach it as a wellness tool to kind of calm down. Again, it fits with the culture. It's like you don't reach for your beer, you reach for your meditation cushion.
Look, the set of philosophical ideas from these that point at a kind of detachment. Oh, that's probably not the right word. One book that really influenced me was called The Feeling Buddha, talked about the original Sanskrit when Buddha was talking about the Noble Truths, that the idea of enlightenment is often comes from a Sanskrit word where people think it means putting out the fire. But his whole argument was actually that the Sanskrit says without wind, and that the idea is not to put out the fire, but it's just to not have it blow everywhere that's going to burn down the barn. And that whole set of philosophical ideas, especially, I mean, because in the East have been thinking about studying consciousness for thousands of years. The depth of knowledge is stunning. That, because of my madness was so caught up with invasive thoughts and ideas. It was incredibly important to cultivate some kind of detachment from that and not to identify in that stream.
To calm your mind and get the passions
Yes.
under control in a sense. But then it reached a point where, whoa, that's actually not what you need.
No.
And the East is giving you that, but you want to go back to the West. You said Christianity and the Western traditions are more about exploring the passions or connecting with the passions or relating to the passions.
I mean, Christianity is, there's so many Christianities.
Right. Well, I'm thinking for you, because you left the East and came back to the West.
Yes. After my 20s and that kind of vertical orientation, I gave all that up and I kind of went horizontal, is how I think about it. I got very interested in ecology and forget the transcendent realm. Let's just pay attention to the forest and the way that the forest is here and all of that. And I spent a lot of years, so my metaphysical orientation to the world was much more based on, oh, look, there's a creosote bush, and the creosote bush has a subjectiveness, and this wonderful to be in communion. But I kind of hit a wall with that about 2 years ago, and now I'm trying to go vertical again. And in this case, I'm trying to align and connect with my ancestral traditions, which are Christian. It's a stumbling road, but I feel called and I'm committed to trying to find a path I can walk on with it.
So when you've been more horizontal and
Hmm.
more connecting with ecology, what are some of the things that you're looking at in terms of relating to madness and reality? You said communing with the creosote, and we were talking previously about bacteria and sort of the questions of what consciousness might be and what reality might be.
For instance, a lot of analyses of madness will focus on obviously you have the biological people. I call that the machine model. The medical model is
Right.
so we got all that, and that's domineering. But then even the models beyond that, trauma, and they can have a socio-political lens, and it's still all kept in social formation, I guess. And I got really interested in actually the ecological reasons why certain kinds of states of consciousness might emerge. I was curious about, for instance, what we call psychosis, about why is that on the planet? What is that doing for the planetary organism that we live within?
Yeah, because if you think about it, if we are evolving beings, if we're the results of evolution, and psychosis is merely breakdown and maladaptive and negative, why would it persist?
Hmm. That's right.
Why does a species have a trait that is completely consistent that it has access to this thing called psychosis? It must be serving some ecological purpose, function. It must actually contribute to the fitness of the organism from a evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah, that's really important. I mean, the fact that it's a universal and historical experience says something about that it sort of belongs. And I got interested with psychedelics, and as you well know, you've written beautifully about psychedelics. When LSD was first entering the West, people would call it psychotomimetic, that it mimics psychosis. And psychiatrists used to take it to try and understand the experiences of their patients and stuff. So it was well understood back then that what happens on LSD is a kind of experiential world that's close to what happens to someone who is kind of involuntarily met with a kind of psychosis. And when I started down that trail, I started thinking, well, interestingly, psychedelic plants and fungi have been on the planet for tens of millions of years, and animals use them.
Tell us about that. How? What did they?
Yeah, there's a great book called Animals and Psychedelics. I mean, insects use them, animals use them. They use them in all kinds of different ways. For instance, goats will go lick a psychoactive lichen, but only when they're grieving, when one of their herd dies.
Grieving goats lick psychedelic lichen?
That's right. This is all over the animal kingdom. I mean, you got caribou with the Amanita muscaria mushroom made famous in Super Mario Brothers. Only certain members of the herd will go and eat it. And so these might be pioneering individuals within the herd. In the talk I gave, I was showing a video of ants who farm, they raise these beetles in their colonies. They're called the yellow beetle because the beetle secretes out of its butt a psychoactive substance. And so they actually raise the beetle and they lick it at certain times. And they actually provide some of the chambers that they would provide for their own kids, they provide for the beetles' kids as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So the beetles get something out of it, right? The ants are raising them and protect them. They'll go kill everything. And then the ants are getting it because they want the psychoactive experience.
I knew this was going to be an interesting interview. You're blowing my mind already. So we've got plants, we've got goats,
Yes.
we've got ants, and we've got reindeer that are purposely seeking out. This has been observed. This isn't speculative at a fish concert. This is actually like biology, right? This is for real zoology, whatever scientists, the official experts have actually confirmed this, that they're intentionally getting high. And actually, it
Yes.
isn't just one species. It's throughout nature, there are organisms that are consciously accessing psychedelic plants for some kind of change. And so why? Why do they do it?
Well, if some of these plants are psychotomimethicking, I think it's fair to say that they're intentionally inducing a kind of psychotic experience. This is desired for some members of some animals, but it goes beyond that. They're not just there for the animals, they're there for the plants. So let's take psilocybin, for instance, made famous by magic mushrooms. This is a molecule that is released by mushrooms into the mycelial, the underground fungal network, to plants. Plants have serotonin receptors, which psilocybin fits into. Psilocybin looks like serotonin. So serotonin is not a brain molecule. It's all over nature. It's a form of speech. When serotonin is released from one cell to another, they're saying something. It's a kind of language. They use other molecules, they use electricity. What's happening is that the mushroom is releasing the psilocybin into the underground fungal network, which is then getting into different grasses and plants. So if you take it as a given that plants are sentient, which I do, and there's tons of evidence of this now, I don't think you need all the evidence. Just listen to any human being before 300 years ago. This is well understood. Then the plants are also undergoing a kind of psychosis-like experience by tripping out on psilocybin. Psilocybin's been around for tens of millions of years. So why would this happen? Well, interestingly, with psilocybin specifically, where does that often show up? It often shows up in disturbed ecosystems. So a forest has gone through a trauma, and now it's a kind of grassland where, everything is different. And that's where those mushrooms often show up. Now, this isn't the case for all psychoactive plants, but this is an interesting example. So psilocybin shows up in the disturbed ecosystem, goes to the plants, and I think there's convincing evidence of this. What it's doing when it goes into a plant is it's breaking down the habits of the plant. In brain science and psychedelics, they call this a default mode network, but that's problematic. It's a similar process where what you're doing is you're shaking things up. Anyone that's taken psilocybin understands this. I mean, you go through an experience where things are shook up. Your senses, your sensory life is more amplified. Suddenly, you smell colors, things come in, all this kind of stuff. So the plants, their senses are more open. And why would you want that? So that you can create new behavioral patterns to adapt to the circumstance. I mean, that's a physicalist explanation. I also just think these things are meant to open us up to transcendental forces.
Okay, so we've got goats that are licking lichens when they grieve. We've got reindeer that are eating
Mhm.
Amanita muscaria, and we've got ants that are cultivating symbiotically this relationship with beetles so that they can harvest this psychedelic. And so we start to think of like, okay, those are individuals that are seeking some use of the psychedelic substance. But you're saying that actually a mushroom that has psilocybin in it isn't just kind of producing this intoxicant that then another organism finds useful, like poison that's helpful to humans. It's like a byproduct of the mushroom. You're saying that actually the mushroom is producing psilocybin because it's a way that the entire plant habitat is communicating with each other. And that they're communicating with each other because they have certain kinds of needs from an ecological standpoint to kind of shake up something that needs to be disrupted because that habit or that stuck place, let's say, needs to find some way of opening out beyond itself. I'm thinking about, I know very little about ecology or farming or gardening, but I do know that apparently, like if you have an area of the earth that has been poisoned, that certain plants will be attracted to that area because they process the poison and they can slowly start to regenerate.
That's right.
They can leach out certain heavy metals or certain kinds of toxins. And so there's a balancing. It sounds like you're saying is psychedelics are also playing that kind of role on the plant level, not just on the level of reindeers and goats and ants, but on the plant level.
That's right.
And they're providing something that the ecosystem needs in order to reestablish its
Yep.
balance. And the way that they're doing it is that the psychedelics shake up, or they open up, or they move beyond some kind of limited repetitive impasse that the ecosystem is
Yep.
at. Is that, am I following you?
Yeah, I think so. All these kinds of ways of looking at it always feel a bit limited, but I think that's right. And, psilocybin was very likely invented by bacteria. So bacteria are the ultimate chemists. They're amazing. And they swap genes and all this kind of stuff, and they're communicating, they work in colonies. They fix the planet to make the planet a place where animals could emerge, for instance. And they've been doing that for billions of years, and they invented the psilocybin. And to the extent that mushrooms took it up, it's sort of donated from the little creatures who are on the planet, perpetuating ever more glorious forms of creaturely life. So I think, to make an analogy then, psychosis can arrive for an individual when there is a need to shake things up, to reorganize. I don't think it should just be thought of as an individual level. I mean, you think about this with like the dream world. Dreams arrive at an individual level, and we all often treat them as like individual development tools, right? Like, I'm
Right.
going to go discover the capital S self. But actually, there's cultures who, in the morning, they come together and they all bring their dreams, right, to the circle, because dreams are seen as providing insight or guidance for the whole.
Yeah, they don't belong to an individual. They're shared because the dream is for everyone, because you're living collectively.
Coming from creator. We're constantly being called towards something at the species level, and that's a sort of transcendent end, and that guidance shows up in things like dreams. So with something like psychosis, if I take it from that plant world, I would say that for some people, not for everybody, I mean, you can't make generalizations about all this stuff. It arrives at a point at which a person needs a kind of complete reorganization of psychic content. And that could also benefit the community. It might not. And when it arrives, it's not like the endpoint is built in that all is going to go well. It can be a complete hellscape because your senses are wide open and things are coming through and you're trying to make sense of them. And that can be very confusing if you don't have elders. Because what often makes something like psychosis so traumatic is the kind of loneliness of it and the isolation from it. So I think the process itself has an ecological function, but that doesn't romanticize it into, oh, it's meant to lead to a particular outcome where all is well. It can also lead to a complete collapse.
Well, part of it is that when we're speaking of psychosis as having evolutionary significance or evolutionary necessity, the species needs it. That's why it persists. We're speaking on very large timescale
Yes.
of very large aggregates of individuals. So an individual experience may be at variance with that. It may be very not useful
Mhm.
for an individual just because the usefulness is that we're speaking about is the larger scale. At the same time, it's very instructive because it's going to have to be useful overall, or else it wouldn't keep happening
That's right. And increasing, actually.
and increasing. Okay, so what I'm thinking about is that there's a lot of social psychological models of psychosis where, like the double bind theory, for example, that basically someone is at an impasse. There's something strange happening. There's a kind of a captivity or a trap or a limitation that the person can't manage or comprehend or even speak about or even reflect on in the ordinary way that's available. And so, boom, here comes psychosis as like a fourth dimensional solution to a three-dimensional problem. It's like a way of just jumping out of the circumstance
Yes.
in a desperate, kind of chaotic way that nonetheless creates the possibility for completely unexpected resources to
Yeah.
come in, something completely new, because what's available isn't going to work. So, boom, the person goes into a psychosis in order to find something. And the most classic example would be a secret that's not acknowledged in the family. The secret is not being acknowledged. No one's willing to do it. And so the person becomes the identified patient as a way of kind of sounding an alarm. So there's like a healing purpose or a compensating or way of addressing a problem. But on the outside, we don't even know what the problem is.
Yeah.
because often the person can't communicate. They don't even know what the problem is.
Yes,
But if we think about psychosis from an evolutionary standpoint, we think, okay, this is actually a capacity that humans have
that's right.
as a way of jumping out of the system.
Right.
When everything is lost, when there's no way out, your mind will go to these extreme states as a desperate attempt to kind of reorganize on a different level using a completely different set of frameworks.
Yes, I love all that. And I think at a physical list level, you're getting more sensory information because, for instance, the brain, I don't think it's like a movie projector. I think it's more, Aldous Huxley called it a reducing valve. It's always filtering. There's a lot of reality out there. And the brain is this kind of super sophisticated creature that is intended to filter out things. And that's called sensory gating. Like it's always gating what's coming in through the senses. At the kind of physical level, this psychosis thing is the gates aren't so shut. So there's more information coming in. Again, not to say it's a good thing. It just seems to me that that's the case at that moment. Yeah.
But from the evolutionary standpoint, if the gates are closed and things are going well for the organism or for the community, then the gates are going to stay closed.
Yes.
But then if something happens, like the goat loses its goat buddy and now it's grieving,
Mhm.
the gates that were closed before were working when there was no grief, but now you've got grief.
Right.
And now the goat needs to open the gates
Right.
because the resources that were working suddenly aren't working. So we got to open the gates, we got to go beyond
Yeah.
and then bring in something from the outside.
Yes. Yes. And that this is all part of a design, in my view, in which, life is not some random sort of meaningless billiards just bouncing around, but even at species levels, we're being called. And this is all part of the pulling towards that kind of transcendent end. This is part of the process of doing that.
When you say transcendent end, from an ecological standpoint, is it maybe sufficient to say that life has an intrinsic drive to be more complex and more intricate and more expressive and more unique? Because the longer that life exists, it doesn't just survive, because you could survive by just being ice and then you just survive, and being inert, but you survive through becoming more and more differentiated, more complex, more individual, more unique. This is what Jung called the individuation
Yes.
process. I mean, obviously, Jung is very individualistic, and I read Jung as a very ecological thinker because there's a way in which the forces of nature are working through the psyche, and they're working in exactly the same way. And it's survival, yes, but it's also expression of uniqueness.
Yes.
And that's constantly what organisms are moving towards.
Yeah, is more glorious forms of expression. I mean, an ostrich is a glorious creature, and so is a bacteria. I guess, one way I would think about this, I think the transcendent ends. I mean, I sort of like the old philosophical formulation of this being the good, the beautiful, and the true. That creatures are being drawn to the good, the beautiful, and the true. So, insofar as we have innate drives, these are being sort of pulled from the transcendent and try to be pulled out of us. But I think that's applicable to all creatures. So when you're asking about the ecological thing, in my view, Earth is a creature, and we have every reason to believe that. Biomes, forests are creatures at the forest level. And Earth is also part of the drive towards the good, beautiful, and true. So is the sun. So the transcendent, I mean, this is one of the problems I have with Christianity. Sometimes it skips all the intermediary layers. It's just humans and God. And I'm thinking, well, actually, we're also part of this glorious planet who is also part of God and part of a solar system. And all of it is sort of being pulled towards a kind of end.
Yeah, because I think the fault that has been made in consciousness studies has been to think that it's humans that have it
That's right.
and other organisms don't.
Right.
Whereas actually, the more that we're learning about the origins of language, the more that we're learning about the complex intelligence of corvids or orca whales and the communication and the language and the culture and the learning and even the passing down, we're actually seeing that consciousness is kind of more this gradient,
Mm-hmm.
that we have it, but other organisms, other animals may have it maybe in a different way than us, but we've all kind of got this same thing, which makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. You don't have nature without consciousness, and then suddenly God sends a lightning bolt, and then boom, now consciousness exists in humans. It's
That's
actually
right.
consciousness was built into the directionality of it as a potential from the very beginning. And Noam Chomsky said something really interesting about evolution, because I think he was asked whether he was a creationist or not, whether he thought that, God had intended there to be intelligence, or whether it just emerged purely accidentally through evolution. And he said that actually maybe consciousness is built in to the structure of the universe, the way that the complexity of the lattice of a crystal structure in a mineral is just built in. There's a mathematics to a crystal
Yeah.
that just emerges because it was built into the chemistry. Or gravity is something that just seems to be built in. We don't say what causes gravity. Gravity is built in. So maybe
Right.
consciousness is sort of like gravity, or the complexity of emergent properties of chemical structure, because it's just a condition. We don't have to explain it by the existence of a prior, more fundamental cause. And then we create all these problems about how it's sort of like created out
Right.
of nothing, where actually it's built into the system, it's built into existence. Every culture, every history, every story has always been plants are sentient,
Uh-huh.
animals are sentient, everything is sentient. And to me, that seems to be the fundamental truth. It's an intuitive truth
Yes.
that you can experience, but then the mechanistic view that says, well, where does it come from, kind of creates this impasse. Well, actually, it comes from everything.
Yeah. And when you're asking where does it come from, you're actually using consciousness to ask the question. There's no getting behind consciousness.
Right. It's just part of the whole thing.
That's right.
And then you ask, well, what causes or how you define it? You create these intellectual impasses, these language games that just destroy your ability to think about it.
Yeah, and I would say I'm sort of an animist in the sense that I would think that consciousness is in all matter. So it's in atoms and everything.
It might be very slow consciousness or very fast. It's hard for us to recognize it as consciousness.
That might be a kind of wisdom. If we think of the brain and nervous system and human beings as being a kind of architecture that reduces reality, it may turn out that bacteria actually have way more access to reality than we do, because we've got all these filtering mechanisms or dynamisms. When you look at trees have been around for hundreds of millions of years, and they're slow, they're still, they make weather, they do extraordinary things. Maybe slowness is the wisdom. I mean, we're sort of the new creatures running around.
There's nothing superior or inferior. It's just different. But we're caught in
Yeah.
a framework of the 80 plus years of life. And so we have a certain speed that we can
Hmm.
recognize something that seems like us. And there we say, then it has consciousness because it behaves and acts like us. I wanted to get back to this question of psychedelics, because yes, the goat is licking the lichen and getting high. And yes, the reindeer is eating the Amanita muscaria mushroom. And yes, the ant is harvesting the psychedelic from the beetle. But there's something missing in that experience, because in the human use of psychedelics, there is an incredibly elaborate mediation by ceremony, ritual, language, expectation, symbol, the social constructedness of the psychedelic experience. And then when we get into psychedelics as therapy or psychedelics as healing, which is the discourse that
Hmm.
come out, it just is psychedelics in the brain. We're going to shake up the default mode network. You're going to have some new ideas. We're not even going to think about the social constructedness of the psychedelic experience. And that, I think, is the real problem with, ironically, the substances that for many people give access to these incredible metaphysical, existential, transcendent, visionary understandings of consciousness have been just turned into this super reductionistic, biological, mechanistic framework in order to offer it as a new form of psychiatric drug for healing and marketing.
I mean, listen, you've been a voice in the wilderness there calling attention to this. You've actually really deeply influenced me. I did a lot of psychedelics when I was younger, but then I kind of put it aside for a long time because, I wasn't living in places where people were talking like that. And when it started to emerge again and I experimented with psychedelics again, apart from my autoimmune stuff, I was trying to communicate with bacteria.
How did that go?
My use of psychedelics right now is I'm very careful. I'm not going into the kind of altered state where I think that it would be possible to receive some kind of communication. I'm not going to the places I think that perhaps I would need to go. So I got excited when all of it kind of entered the cultural scene again. And I sort of did the naive thinking And then your writing has been really important to me to call out how all of this stuff is going to get filtered through the systems that we got.
But Stephen, I hope I wasn't a buzzkill that started to discourage you from getting high on psychedelics.
But you are the best kind of buzzkill because you're so right. No, there's a direction this is all going, and I feel like it's unstoppable. It's just, this is the way all this stuff does. I mean, look at 10, 15 years ago in mental health, trying to talk about trauma was still radical. I went and I looked at the materials on the National Institute of Health in the United States on schizophrenia. They have hundreds of pages. And I click Control F, find the word trauma. Zero. Now trauma is a big part of the discourse. But what's happening, it's just getting sucked right into the machine model.
Trauma is over. Trauma is machine model now.
And listen to the words like, oh, trauma is stored in your body. That's a computer metaphor.
You're dysregulated. You have to re-regulate your system. And
that's right. Or you have automatic, the word automatic responses, fight, flight, freeze, parasympathetic nervous system.
Machine metaphor, pure machine metaphor.
Yes. So psychedelics, that's where they're going. And then we'll need a whole another movement to try and bring them back to something. But I mean, sometimes I think about this. Listen, if you live in a culture that violates the law of the land, that what you take from the land, you have to give back in kind in some way. If a culture is violating that, then everything else that comes from that is going to be diluted and misguided in a way. I mean, you can always find examples of like, well, it's great that psychedelics are being used for people with chronic depression or whatever, because it helps 60% of them or whatever. I mean, one, it's just not what they're deliberately here on the planet for. I'm really glad that it helps some individuals, but we can't use that as a way of thinking about how we interface with nature. Like, oh, we'll just take this molecule from the plant, we'll patent it, we'll give it to someone with a diagnosis, and they'll be better so they can function better in society. It's just completely off course, the whole purpose, I think.
Yeah, and the motivation of the machine in terms of making money and status and power is so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to get back to this question of communicating with bacteria.
Yeah.
Because you could say that, okay, the imaginal realm, like dreams or imagination, come from the psyche. But you could also say that when you have a dream, bacteria are communicating with you through the dream.
That's right.
That's the ensemble of organisms that we live inside of this giant conversation, this incredibly elaborate, complex conversation. And we're stuffing our fingers in our ears.
Yeah.
And so someone like Jung comes along, or indigenous practices or prayer or whatever it is, and they said, hey, take your finger out of your ear. And the way that it comes through, the way that the conversations, the dialogue starts to happen is through imagination, it's through dreams, it's through visionary states, it's through inspiration, it's through ideas. But really what that is that's the conversation getting through of the other organisms.
Yes.
The other organisms are communicating with you. And so in a strange way, we could say that if you want to use psychedelics to open to the conversation, you could also use psychosis to open to the conversation, or you could also use like 10% psychosis, like altered states, or some kind of like trying something, putting yourself under stress or putting yourself into a situation that's going to shake up your consciousness and break some of those gates down and open up some of that information flow, like 10% of psychosis, that the principle underlying both is the same, that we want to somehow restore this dialogue and this conversation by allowing some of the information that we're pushing out to start to come in and then get us out of those routine habits of thinking and behavior that are stuck and in an impasse and that are leaving us trapped. So fundamentally, whether it's psychosis or psychedelics or some other means, the whole point is to get out of our ruts of thinking, like the goat or the reindeer or the ant are getting out of, and welcome in something new, which is the ensemble of conversation, because it has so much wisdom.
Yes.
The bacteria are looking at us and they're saying, guys, you just need to do this.
We're trying to talk to you.
We're trying to talk to you. We just need to do this. I want to tell you a really quick story. There's a sort of a science fiction writer, Whitley Strieber, who wrote about communication with aliens. He was very popular in the 90s. I don't know where he is now. He had all these interactions with extraterrestrials, but they never communicated with him. Like he would see them or they would show up or different things would happen. But there was one time when the ETs gave him some communication, they gave him some advice, and they said, stop eating sugar.
That's hilarious.
So maybe the bacteria have some kind of simple message, like get off the corn syrup, people. Like put down your phones. It's not hard. Just get away from electromagnetic radiation. You'll be able to think clearly, and then you'll be able to have better ideas.
Yes,
Get into nature more. I mean, sometimes the wisdom is so simple, but we're just not listening to it.
that's right. And I've often thought about, in terms of that ensemble of conversation, that, most theories of mind, in the West at least, they're developed in urban or in places where philosophers are sitting in a room that's cut off from the communion. I mean, I've thought about, the difference is, if you grow up in an old growth forest and you're thinking about consciousness in the forest, you're actually part of a communion that's going to help bring about ideas that are probably more accurately reflective. And so we have I mean, philosophy, so much of it is just this abstract intellectual masturbation. It's just chasing its tail and stuff, and all these concepts that refer to more concepts and more and all this kind of stuff. And I think part of that is just a product of cultures living without, not being rooted in the kind of communion of species. But yeah, I think that shouting that you're talking about of other species wanting us to hear would also be a part of why things like psychosis would be increasing in the planet's telos and the directionality of the planet. I don't want to denigrate the fact that there's all kinds of other variables here, like plastics in the water.
So the increase of psychosis isn't necessarily a pathological influence like trauma, but actually the increase of psychosis might be the organism trying to find wisdom. That the increase of psychosis is actually a search for solutions outside of the box.
Maybe at a meta level. Yeah. I mean, I think at an individual level, I mean, trauma is so obviously vital for a lot of people's kind of narrative of how they came to have different states of consciousness. When I was a kid, I was probably born very sensitive. But then after going through some traumatic experiences, I started watching out for things, right? So my senses, and that's a double-edged sword. Maybe I could hear music different than someone else, but also, I used to sit out in the hallway thinking I was going to be murdered and just listen for hours, any sound, call the police, that kind of thing. And so my senses were more open. And what happens when your senses are open like that is the energy of your system is diverting more resources towards that aim and less towards, say, digestion. So I had all kinds of stomach problems when I was a kid. A lot of people do. My energy is focused towards other things, watching out.
I had a lot of stomach problems when I was a kid. It's interesting.
Yeah, and if you're not digesting properly, then you can start to get all kinds of bacterial overgrowths and imbalances. So that can then bilaterally then influence your consciousness because bacteria caught up with that. So there's a way in which trauma, it obviously has a huge influence, but it can think of it in biophysical ways with bacteria and all kinds of organisms in your body, how all of that is just at play. Social experience of harm being done to you will then change the kind of ecology of microorganisms within it can, right? And then all of that's tied up in a planet who also has drives towards things.
Yeah, a planet in a sense is being traumatized. It's having this huge infliction.
Uh-huh.
The biological determinism is used as a hammer to just say, oh no, it's not trauma. It's not changing your relationships. It's not psychological. It's not anything that's accessible. It's just broken genes and broken brains. So you got to take the pills. That was the equation. And now I think we've gotten much more sophisticated with genetics. We're able to say, okay, genetics are not just a blueprint. There's an epigenetic relationship. The genes turn on and turn off. They get activated. They're deactivated basically in response to environment. That genes can actually be turned on and then acquired through environmental influences intergenerationally. And then we've gotten a lot more sophisticated around the role of stress, the way in which a traumatic injury, a psychological condition, can affect the way that you're processing food. Now suddenly your digestion and your gut is changed. And so we've kind of gotten away from this strict either it's biological or psychological framing of things. And I think that's a very positive direction as long as we don't get too lost going back to a biological determinism, because people do have such a sophisticated holistic health understanding these days. But I see lots of people who are just suffering tremendously, diagnosed with psychosis, and they may have, huge family resources, They're trying all kinds of supplements and treatments and holistic this and food solution this and it's just not helping them at all. So it's clearly more complicated than going back to a biological reductionism. But I think that we do need to get more sophisticated because I mean, I feel like my changes in nutrition, and it sounds like for you, my changes in nutrition were crucial
Yeah.
for getting me back into some kind of space of clarity.
Oh, they're stunning for me.
But then also you can sort of say, well, why did I have the discipline or the interest or the motivation to make those nutrition changes?
Right.
And then maybe that itself is an empowerment attitude that I had a psychological change that got me interested. And, idea of nourishment as being self-care and a relationship with your parents and family of origin and nourishing yourself and connecting with yourself. But I think it would be a big mistake for us to go purely in a psychological determinist direction around psychosis because we are physical organisms and the psychological and the biological are so closely related.
Yes. And inside of all of that is the kind of spiritual aims. If it's not random, then there has to be a kind of framing of intentionality between everything that's not just about survival and reproduction. I mean, this is my problem with epigenetics still treats the gene as central. And, genes make amino acids that are folded into protein. Okay, well, the whole folding process and transcription, what is causing that? And they've been saying for like, oh, it has to be the genes have built into their four molecules the direction. And I'm much more partial to people like Rupert Sheldrake who talk about morphogenetic fields. There's like literally immaterial fields that are animating matter. I'm also kind of a monist that do accept the kind of insights that people have had over time that everything is one. But then thinking is kind of dualistic. So it's very hard to even come up with words. The Tao Te Ching, which has had such an influence on me, famously begins that the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. So every time we start talking about this, we end up in a world of separation, which is necessary for thought, but seems to also miss it.
Well, it becomes generative because if we could capture it in language, everything would stop.
Yes.
It has to be radically open to itself. It has to constantly be going back over itself to create something new in order for there to be an evolutionary process. If our minds could just reflect reality, then the whole process would just be done.
Yeah.
We're part of the growth and the change and the evolution. So it has to be open-ended. It has to be indeterminate. And I think that's fundamentally why it's paradoxical.
Yes, and paradox being sort of the hardest thing for a mind to hold or reconcile. I was going to say with the diet stuff, I started experimenting with diet 10 or 12 years ago for my autoimmune. I was stunned at what it did for my consciousness. I was not doing it for that reason.
So what did the diet changes do for your consciousness?
Well, because I've been mostly like ketogenic, I mean, the last 2.5 years, I've only eaten beef and cheese. I don't recommend it. I'm doing this for extreme circumstances.
Because of your autoimmune disease, and it's been helping.
Yes. So ever since I've been doing kind of ketogenic thing, I still go through phases. So from October to March of this year, I was really lit up and I was pulling up to 3 all-nighters a week.
Lit up like you had lots of energy and you were really inspired.
Yeah, and I made a music album. I was out in the desert. There's such precious times, but I've only had a few of these where like I really, really just feel animated. What I'm saying is that during that time, I wasn't sleeping 2 or 3 nights a week. Now, I never missed 2 nights in a row because that's dangerous. So I'm still going through an experience that could be called some psychiatric terminology.
Altered state. You could say it's psychotic or manic.
Yeah, being on a diet where my blood sugar isn't crashing on top of that has been hugely advantageous, right?
For navigating it, for keeping it under control.
That's right. What I do if I pull an all-nighter is the next night when I start to get really ramped up, right? Like I don't want to go back to sleep.
Right, exactly. It's so seductive.
That's when the spirit comes. I eat a pound of cheese. I eat a pound of cheese and then I'm gone
Wow.
every time because it's soporific. So the kind of phase changes that I experienced when I was younger, I still experience them. But the circumstances of both my biological reality, which is on this completely different way of eating, helps, but also circumstantially. I mean, you were asking me at the beginning, why do I live on the road? Part of it was because I wanted to create a life where the things that kind of animate me could be better facilitated. And like I've been celibate for 7 years. If I was caught up in a social world, those 5 months I just went through would have been all kinds of problematic. right? I would have been interfacing with a lot of different variables. And that is the kind of thing that would make it so hard for me when I was young. Whereas this time I'm out in the desert, I'm in my camper, I'm working, but I've got that under wraps and I can just be alone a lot with that. And that's really created a different kind of outcome.
You could say it's like a monastic lifestyle, but that really wouldn't understand. It's more like you're trying to reduce the noise
That's right.
so that you can identify what the different influences are. I mean, the sense I have, it's almost like an alchemist. You created this vessel and you want to be able to control the variables in your experiments. So you can understand what's the relationship between the cheese and the sleep and the inspiration and the making the album.
Yes, I felt compelled to do it. I did not do any of it as a sort of, oh, I want to be monastic or anything like that.
Right. It's not about virtue or attitude or piety.
So yeah, there were just kind of solutions. I love how you just said reducing the noise. And then they become a kind of spiritual thing. I mean, being celibate, it has a spiritual quality, but I became celibate because I found intimate relationships very hard on my mind constantly.
Yeah, I hear that one.
And and then the attitude is like, well, just do the work. And I'm like, at some point, like I could keep doing the work, but at some point it's like I don't actually want to work that hard on that.
Right.
How about I stop doing all of that and try and do something else? Now, this is problematic because it can reinforce individual. Like I do believe, sex and family and all of this is very important culturally. You don't want everyone going in a route of individual.
Right. Well, you don't want everyone in the tribe to be going through a psychotic initiation process at the same time either.
Yeah. So, but I think a small percentage of people are going to need to set the conditions of their life insofar as they're able, like with resources or privilege, to be able to kind of live an alternative path. But you don't want these things to become dominant either culturally. I mean, that's a whole other discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I don't take any of my experience as anything that I would even think that other people would need to do. Most people are called to have family, love, all that kind of stuff. And that's probably as it should be.
Well, that's what I think is fundamentally significant about what you're describing is that it's a discovery process that comes from you being in touch with yourself. It's not a prescriptive program that you subscribe to some YouTube channel and they said, okay, go get a trailer and start eating beef and cheese. You yourself are learning from yourself and your own process, which in a sense, that's fundamentally, I think, what the ecological scientific inquiry is about. It's about observation and involvement and being close to the subject that you're studying. I kind of have a sense of you sort of like a Thoreau character, but also sort of like an alchemist or an ecologist. You're like Jane Goodall in the forest with the gorillas, but you're the gorilla as well as the scientist studying the gorilla.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, at a base level, I mean, all of it is also really compelled by enormous physical pain. I never really got into kind of, oh, the pain is there for a reason. Like that didn't feel validating, although I can accept that there's probably a layer at which all of this makes sense, but that just doesn't work for me, or at least when I've been at my worst. And that kind of compelled me to really have to try something different.
Yeah, it's that mixture of you feeling pressured to do it, but also doing it for your own reasons. But even with the interest in Christianity and your ancestral roots, there isn't like a meaning making that happens around the pain that you suffer. Or is there just flat out zero sum? This is like a bad thing.
Well, that's really interesting. I sort of think of my pain so utilitarian. Eat this food and you feel better. Do this amount of walking because I'm not really that kind of a thinker otherwise. I almost treat my body like a machine with the autoimmune disease. But yeah, I mean, look, the path back to Christianity, I've been off of it for 20 years and I've been trying to walk it the last 2 years. I'm still in a very novice place of exploration. And certainly the central image of a cross and suffering and a kind of resurrection that happens through the suffering feels meaningful, but I'm trying to set my life up in a way where God can animate me more, but I'm still in a very inchoate world with all of that. It's made a lot more difficult by the fact that the Gospels, like I really love the Gospels, and then we have all of the Christian interpretations. A lot of them I find miss the mark.
It is sort of the path of a desert monk or a desert mystic. It's interesting because a lot of my philosophy and spirituality and study of different religions and theology is very heady intellectual, but there's something about the connection with Christianity that feels deeper. It just feels like a little bit more intuitive, a little bit more visceral, and it resonates or connects with my memories.
Yeah.
with my father and my mom and different things growing up. And that is kind of inchoate. It is kind of like you can't put it into a language schema, but it has that power. And I think that's what Jung was on about when he was strongly cautioning against Westerners just attaching to, oh, now I'm a Taoist, now I'm a yogi, now I'm interested in Tibetan Buddhism. And actually, because it is something that can detour us from that deeper affinity. One of the things that I kind of discovered is that ever since I was a teenager, I got exposed to, there was a Catholic activist, Petra Kelly, who was a very strong nonviolence radical in Germany, who was at one of the foundations of the German Green Party back when it was West Germany. And the Green Party has evolved and become something different, but it was a very pacifist, very anti-war, very ecological, and very militantly nonviolent direct action movement. I got exposed to that when I was a teenager. I was at a conference and she was at, and it made so much sense to me. And then looking back on that, that whole Christian ethos has really been operating in the background
Yeah, wow.
for a lot of my life. The whole emphasis on service, the importance of love and compassion
Yes.
and meeting people and listening. And those aren't things that come out of a Buddhist, Taoist framework spontaneously. Those are cultural imprints, I think, that a template, let's say, that I was kind of following naturally. And so my own interest in Christianity, especially also through Jung and through a lot of different other sources, has been rediscovering like, oh, I was kind of operating on these assumptions all along.
Yes, exactly.
It's always kind of been in the background.
And you take it for granted. You don't realize it comes from somewhere until you learn.
Exactly. Even my interest in Marxism, and Marxism is millennial kind of Christian apocalyptic, like we're all going to find the Garden of Eden again. It's, oh, wait a second, that's just a rehash of Christian tropes. So it was always there. And so as I get older, I'm kind of like discovering myself as a Christian that I already was.
I really resonate with that.
Yeah, even saying I'm a Christian is not something that I feel myself cringe when I say that. Yeah.
I feel like I'm probably going to get there. Yes, it's like all the symbology that I have, all of that stuff is tied into it. But just like you said, the values, the ethics I've thought about the world, I've just kind of taken them as a given. Of course, it makes sense to turn the other cheek or to forgive. But when you learn about the context in which that arose, I mean, it was insanely radical. And of course, that is not the way that plenty of people have operated.
Absolutely.
It's not to favor Christianity. But there's all kinds of beautiful religious understandings and stuff all across the world. Some of them get at, I think, a path to God is probably stronger than others. It's not all relativistic. It's just that the Christian thing is a particular kind of lineage that I'm in, but also in the West, the way that we ended up with the kind of cultural products or ways of understanding. One of the things that I think about, like, so take the idea of forgiveness. This might be controversial to say, but I mean, one of the I had run away from Christianity. It's like, screw all that, make fun of it. Like I was on that side. I never became a new atheist.
Yeah, yeah. Me too. It was a joke. Jerry Falwell and the extreme religious.
I was like, this is ridiculous. But I remember after that, Dylan Roof killed 9 black parishers in South Charleston.
Oh, yeah.
There was this stunning thing where 2 days later, one of the mothers got up
Yeah.
on a public site and said she forgave him. So, what in the world produces an ethic where somebody comes at? Now, the problem with saying that is I would never tell an individual, you need to forgive a killer or a perpetrator, right? Because there's different circumstances, different paths. But I found this incredibly enviable, like it spoke to some part of me that was a lot deeper than just rationalization. And I guess from that, I also then think if the forgiveness ethic that was really infused from Judeo-Christian roots, not the only place it comes from, if that goes away, which it is, then it really does become a situational ethics where everyone's like, well, I don't have to forgive this person, should I? And then it becomes something as an ideal, it collapses.
Yeah.
And I get worried about the kind of atomization and sort of being at each other's throats and how people talk about toxic relationships, toxic this, toxic that. Everything becomes a kind of war or a battleground. So we don't have to have any of the Judeo-Christian ethic, but we do, I believe, as a people trying to live together, we're going to need some replacement if it's going to be replaced, some sort of agreed upon ideals in which we can operate, or we're just going to end up in a kind of collapse of anything like a social fabric of neighborliness or anything like that. It's a kind of hellscape. I sort of see us going there. I don't know if you detect that too.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We take it for granted. So many of the assumptions of just kindness and generosity and,
Uh-huh.
the golden rule, we take it for granted because we could live in a caste society.
That's right.
You're at a lower caste, so we can treat you like an animal, or we could normalize slavery, or we could normalize human sacrifice. I mean, I would like to see the ethic extend to animals, which I think that Christianity has kind of failed, although it was Jesus's teaching was a reaction against the sacrifices,
Yeah,
the lamb sacrifices and the goat sacrifices that came before in Judaism. There was kind of a reform that he was arguing against.
that's right.
That ethic can go further. But I think what you're saying is that we take it for granted until we start losing it. And then we're like, wait a second, love your neighbor as yourself. Wouldn't it be nice to have that back? Because we were kind of assuming that for a long time. But I'm curious, I mean, this is maybe going a far afield, but in the Christian myth or the Christian story, there's the idea that Jesus is a great teacher and that Jesus teaches this incredible message that isn't just be nice to each other. He also goes in, he gets furious at the money changers, and he goes in and he's like actively seeking justice. But there's this piece to the story, which is also the resurrection.
Yeah.
Where you believe that the tomb is empty and the guy came back and, hey, I defeated death. And I've always kind of wondered about that. And I was thinking about it and have been considering it, especially since Easter, that really what it says is that, yes, there's a teaching that love is the way.
Uh-huh.
And there's something more, which is that the universe is magically on the side of that teaching winning. And that's what the resurrection symbolizes, that it's not just a good idea, it's a good idea that's gonna win.
Yeah.
Because the whole universe is on its side and it will make it win magically. And then you can say, well, maybe it's more than magic, maybe it's an ecological, maybe love is somehow built into. And then if we get into the ecology, nature, including the transcendent dimension, if we think about synchronicities, when we think about miracles, and we think about spontaneous healings as being somehow ecologically that they're built into nature. I'm just curious what your thought is.
Yeah. Well, I love that framing. I mean, look, the resurrection, St. Paul says, without the resurrection, this is all in vain. And a lot of Christians have drawn a line there that you have to take the bodily reanimation of Jesus as the central pivot point that separates it from just a teaching about love, but that's actually showing some sort of intervention by God.
It's become a litmus test. If you really believe in the resurrection, then you're really a Christian.
I love how you were framing that, though, because if the bodily resurrection did happen, that is something that's really important. Like if this physically happened on Earth, my view is these things can happen and that they've happened cross-culturally, and that the way that we use consciousness now in dominant society is so limited and myopic, and that there are all kinds of things. There's shape-shifting that's going on. There's ways of calling in the weather pattern, all of this. There's actually an extraordinary book called The World We Used to Live In by the native historian Vine Deloria Jr. It's settler accounts when they were colonizing and settling the United States of what they saw when they were interfacing with native groups who had yet to be colonized.
It's called The World We Used to Live In by Vine Deloria.
Yeah, Vine Deloria Jr. is a wonderful historian. And it's just account after account after account of things that reductionists would say is impossible. You read 200 of these and you start thinking, wait a second, this not only is possible, it looks common. In the Western tradition, there's all kinds of miracles and healings and communications and stuff. So I think a resurrection and all of that's really important. I mean, in terms of my current beliefs about it, I'm reluctant to treat it metaphorically. I think metaphor has a place. I also am quite convinced that the early Christians did not mean it metaphorically.
Right. No, they meant it literally. Yeah.
This happened. So I've been reading just the evidence. I'm exploring how all of that plays out in my life. Even if it literally happened, to me, it still doesn't denote an exclusivity to Christ and Christianity that's never happened elsewhere.
That would be my other question.
I'm a pluralist like this. I'm a universalist.
How are you going to say all the people who never lived during Christ's time are damned?
Yeah.
So there's a big obstacle for a lot of people, I think, deservedly, when you say Christ is the only way. When I hear Christ saying, I am the way, I think it's like I'm the stand-in for love, and love is the way. That's how I hear that. Not you have to have heard the word Christ and know the story and then agree with it, because that is going to exclude way too many people for all kinds of different reasons. It's just absurd, and it's absurd on its face that that's what the meaning would be.
I don't know. I mean, when I picked up the Gospels 2 years ago, I had been 20 years away. I'd never actually read them.
I have a similar experience.
My frame on the world was completely shattered. I had no idea this stuff was going to come back in my life. I got the New Testament, and of course, I did the thing of like, God, give me a sign. I randomly open, and the first thing, the passage I came to, this is just remarkable, was Jesus says to the Pharisees, why does this generation ask for a sign? I tell you, you won't get a sign. I was like, okay, well, there's my sign.
That
And because I've been thinking I'm going to have some mystical experience again. No, no, no. That was it. That was the sign.
was
And
it.
then
That does the trick right there. Yeah.
and then I read the Gospels completely fresh. I read them several times, and I was like, wait a second, this is way different than I had thought. And because I wasn't in some theological stew about what I had to think Jesus was saying.
Right, right.
So I don't know. One thing I'll say, Will, is that I'm weary of going alone. I do want actually a tradition.
Well, that's something there's been a lot of from me, maybe dunking on Eastern religion in this conversation, but that's one of the things I do come back to quite a lot with Buddhism, the idea that the jewels are the Buddha, the life of the Buddha, the teaching of the Buddha, but then there's the community.
Hmm.
And so there is a feeling that it's through interpersonal connection and friendship and disclosure and intimacy and vulnerability with each other that we weave something together that sustains us beyond just how do I sit here and figure it out for myself.
Hmm.
And that's been really super crucial for me, that I have to have those relationships in place in my life to lift me. It's not just, how am I taking care of myself today? It's like, how is the fabric that I'm woven into sustaining me?
Even in the Gospels, where two or three of you gather, there I am. It's difficult for me to swallow that because I spend so much of my time alone.
Maybe you're physically alone, but not relationally alone. Maybe your relationships are very alive inside of your heart and you're still connected with people, even though they're at a distance.
I like that. I mean, look, I love the work I do of training people. So I am interfacing with people all the time and I get a lot of joy out of that. I can be quite extroverted, as you're probably hearing in this conversation, but I also find human relationships in general just exhausting to a point of I can't take it. But I'm open to being guided back to community. And, when I lived in Vermont, I did a lot of that kind of being part of a community.
It is a word that gets so misused. I mean, its community is now just a gathering, or even just a gathering of people online. But there's something about like really feeling authentic vulnerability and trust with each other and feeling like you're not conditionally or transactionally interacting based on, calculating how much you disclose and how much you can get from the other person. That so much of everything just becomes economies. There's something about that authentic freedom to just connect and be vulnerable and to share who we are. That's when I think a real community starts to emerge.
Yeah, and I know you do therapy, don't you?
Yes,
Do you find that you can recreate what you just said in therapy, or do you find that that's always a kind of barrier?
that's a big question. I would say yes. I would say yes. I think it's within a certain role structure and a certain set of expectations. But I think that the money and the time and the schedule and the role are just a means to an end. But the end is fundamentally the same kind of communion and caring. If I don't authentically feel caring towards the people that I work with, it's a big conversation because I also feel very mysteriously connected. Like people show me parts about myself. I'm often working on issues in myself that I find with the clients
Hmm.
that I work with. It's a very mysterious. I'm guided to certain clients. I have strong intuitions. Things will pop into my head. I have a certain intimacy, of maybe if that's not the right word, but yeah, it is the right word. But yeah, it's a big conversation because I know peer support puts a strong emphasis on the voluntary connection between equals. And therapy, the frame clearly is there's one person who's in the helper role and one person who's in the being helped role.
Yeah,
And so I have people close to me who are just anti-therapy. They just don't,
yeah, yeah.
they see that. But then I also think about, well, what is the economics of peer support?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because then you got grants, like somebody's getting paid somewhere. Ultimately, I think that we have to replace therapy with healthy communities.
Yeah. Yes.
There are going to be people who are going to be maybe better listeners, whatever that means, or maybe better isn't the right word, but some people are going to gravitate towards the healer role, or are going to gravitate towards the mediator role or the mentor role. And I think that's just natural in the diversity.
Hmm.
But I think that it has to be about healthy communities. And if we're not building healthy communities, which includes the political, economic, systemic framework to make it possible,
Hmm.
then I think it's just another commodity in a capitalist system. And I don't think that's the solution.
Therapy is an important vehicle, like you're saying, towards the kind of connection. But the reason why that's needed is because of the unthreading going on.
I would say my work as a therapist is kind of like a compromise solution.
Yeah.
If I was really to follow my vocation, I would be someone who just had free time and who could be connecting with people and offering something, maybe even as a specialty. Maybe someone can be really helpful with this kind of thing, but without the transactional economics.
Yep.
But here we are.
Yeah. Like you said, peer supports. I mean, most peer support's all paid too, and it's all systemic. And that forces, like you were using the word compromise, it forces a lot of compromises actually. And part of what I'm always trying to do in intentional peer support when I'm training people is to call attention to, yes, you're in that kind of setting. The sort of values of mutual aid that are, they came from a different place. And so just remembering,
Yes.
but yeah, and I've always thought, I mean, listen, when I was in my madness stuff, a therapist made the most difference in my life of anybody ever. I paid him, although at one point I was like, I'm not paying you because this is bullshit. And he just lit it, like I ended up, paying him later. But but it was an extraordinary connection. And I can't see how that connection would have arisen in voluntary mutual aid. I mean, I was part of Icarus when the forums were all
Yeah, yeah.
alive and well, got a lot out of that. But it's still,
Yeah, it's not quite the same. And does the role have to be a therapist? Could it be a spiritual, a guide? It could be a shaman. It could be a spirit healer. I mean, that role seems to appear
hmm
throughout history. There seems to be some specialization
hmm
of an individual who has a certain kind of capacity to travel between worlds, but it arises because the community gives that person that role,
hmm
not because they claim it because they have credentials or training or entitlement or anything like that. So, when I think about my vocation as a therapist, I think of it kind of in that way. But I think that having the conversation and the inquiry and the opening around what does it mean is really crucial. I do talk with people that I work with about what does it mean that you're paying me?
Yeah.
And you might tell yourself, well, if I wasn't paying him, he wouldn't care for me. Well, really, is that, let's have that conversation, because I mean, I care about people.
Yes.
Stephen, we are just about out of time. So let people know how they can get in touch with you and find out more about your work.
Okay. Yeah, I have a website. It's just Stephen with a V, Morgan, JR as in junior, StephenMorganJr.com. So there's a little stuff on there. And yeah, if you're ever interested in the kind of work that I'm currently doing with intentional peer support, which I just think is a beautiful framework for thinking about kind of mutual aid and connected relationships that have depth, intentionalpeersupport.org. It's got a lot of information on there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us, Stephen Morgan. It's been great to talk to you.
Yeah, man. What a pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to an interview with Stephen Morgan. Stephen is a psychiatric survivor and trainer with intentional peer support, and he's worked in peer support for more than 2 decades. He was the project developer for Soteria House in Vermont. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.